If you have your Bibles, you can turn to Acts. We're going to continue to look at the book of Acts as we are nearing the completion of this. It'll be a few months, but we'll take off for Christmas. But other than that, we're going to roll through some things. And today, I think, is a very timely lesson for many, if not most of us. One of the things about preaching verse by verse through a book, and you outline the book way in advance, and you place what sermon's going to go where, and it changes, because of things that are added on or weather issues or whatever. But then you get to a place where you're like we are today, where we're in Acts chapter 16, and we're talking about verses 11 through 40, and you see how God begins to time out all things, how he begins to show that he is in control, because today is a very timely message for many families in our church in Acts chapter 16. He gets us the place, he gives us the picture of things don't always go as they are planned. Last week we talked about there's always an objective. With God there is always an objective. He always has something planned for you, something that he wants you to do, or something that he wants you to be doing, or as we learned in the case of Paul and Silas, something that he doesn't want you to do. And so today we're going to look at a specific objective that God had given Paul and Silas that we started on last time we were together. And I kind of want to illustrate it to you with this. There is an understanding around the Robinson household concerning my engineering skills. And I'm going to use the roll-up window in the fellowship hall as an example. You remember it was broken. I think I was out of town. Something happened. It broke. It wouldn't go down. And so we called a service professional to come in and fix the window. And he was here when I went back there and talked to him and saw how he was repairing it. And I asked him about it. And he said, those little rubber stoppers are really hard to find. And so he repaired it with just a couple of number 8 screws, if you know what those are. Very, very thin screws, about 2 inches long. And so just after a week or so of that window being raised up and would hit the little stopper at the top, those screws began to bend and it got to where it wouldn't shut again. So I decided that I would look at it. Not a big deal. I simply didn't want to pay another $150 service fee and it be broke again in a couple of weeks. So I went to Lowe's, and I knew they had those little rubber stoppers at Lowe's. Where's Adam? Is he working today, or is he here? There he is. So I went and got the little rubber stoppers and got a couple of them, and I drilled a 1/4-inch hole through it and then drilled a 1/2-inch hole a little bit so the nut would seat on it. It wouldn't stick out and cut anybody. I drilled the hole out a little bigger in the window so it would fit in. I put it together, and in less than 30 minutes, it went right together. That's a miracle of Robinson Engineering, just to let you know. It usually doesn't happen that way. I was so excited about it. It went up, down, did perfect. Everything was just right. As a matter of fact, I picked up all my tools and was home, and I walk in the door, and Missy says, "What are you doing home so soon?" That's usually a day job for me. I said, "It worked just like I thought it would." And she said, "Oh." I said, "I think my engineering skills are improving." And she said, "Well, maybe after 50 years, you're trying to figure a few things out." So later that night, we were up here, and when she said something about the way my engineering skills had improved, I could sense a little skepticism in her voice. But I told her I'd already been up there, and it worked just fine. We had to come back up here to, set up for something that evening before church on Sunday. This was on Saturday. And, I'm kind of like a cat. You know how, a cat loves to kill the snake or whatever he kills, but he wants to bring it to you and show it to you. Hey, look what I did. Look. I did this. So I said, "Hey, baby, come look. And so she's like, "What? It's a window that goes up and down, So, but she was a nice wife and did that anyway. And I rolled it down and rolled it back up, and the little rubber stoppers worked. And so I put it down. I was going to lock it down. And I went to slide the slides that lock it. Yeah, they wouldn't move. Yeah, I had widened the hole just a little bit like I told you, but just wide enough to where it hit the slide. And so when I tightened the nut on the thing, it froze the slides. Not a good thing. So she's like, "Okay, so here's the unwritten rule in the Robinson household. My engineering skills are this. I always have to do it twice the first time." Anybody else like that? Oh, thank you. One person. I always have to do it twice. Thank you. Come on, guys. Yeah. And so I went, doggone it. Didn't take long. Again, I figured it out, moved the nuts and all that kind of stuff and got it working. But I was so excited that I got it done the first time. that it worked according to plan. And then I come up here and I try to do one thing I didn't. Now, I could have taken a screwdriver, and I've started to do this, a screwdriver and a hammer, and chiseled it over to make it lock. But I thought that was a little bit too much for y'all to ask just for my pride, so I went ahead and fixed it properly. But it was a little bit disappointing that I always have to do it twice. And I want to kind of relate that story to what we're looking at in the life of Paul today. What I wanted to do was just leave the screwdriver and the hammer on the counter for you guys and go away and not worry about it anymore. But that's not the right thing to do. Things didn't go the way I had planned, but I still needed to finish the plan. And what do you do when life doesn't go according to your expectations? When things do not go the way that you have them planned? And let's be quite honest, they very seldom go the way we have them planned. Isn't that correct? Things change. Life doesn't turn out the way we expect. What do you do when that happens? Are you going to take a screwdriver and a hammer and just make it work? That's what we do a lot of times. When marriage gets difficult, do you decide just to give up? When careers take alternate routes that you had no idea were about to happen, do you turn in your keys? Do you get frustrated? Do you start blaming other people? What do you do when things don't go the way you expect? Today, in Acts chapter 16, we're going to find the Apostle Paul in the Macedonian city of Philippi. He's there because he had a vision. He's there because God told him to go there. He's doing exactly what he's supposed to be doing. He's exactly where he is supposed to be. And as we talk about the things that he was doing and what he expected to have happen, we're going to find out that Paul had a plan, but nothing went according to plan. Now we're going to read, because there's so much scripture involved today, I'm going to read each section as we get to it. And I want you to, first of all, look at this concept of what Paul had planned. Paul had planned to pray. And as we read verses 11 through 15, we will see that this was his early morning ritual. He wanted to go pray. Beginning in verse 11, then setting sail from Troas, we ran a straight course from Samothrace the next day to Neapolis, and from there to Philippi, a Roman colony, which is a leading city of the district of Macedonia. We stayed in that city for a number of days. On the Sabbath day, we went outside the city gate by the river, where we thought there was a place of prayer. We sat down and spoke to the women gathered there. A woman named Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth from the city of Thyatira, who worshiped God, was listening. The Lord opened her heart to pay attention to what was spoken by Paul. And after she and her household were baptized, she urged us, if you consider me a believer in the Lord, come and stay at my house. And she persuaded us. What I want you to see here is, historically speaking, after receiving what we refer to as the Macedonian vision, Paul and his companions began traveling through that region of Macedonia. And we see Paul beginning to fulfill his vision by moving through those cities, the city of Samothrace and Neapolis and Philippi, all in the region of Macedonia. And the rest of this chapter takes place in the city of Philippi. That's why we titled this message, Objective Philippi. He tells us that Philippi is a leading city of a Roman colony. Now, the fact that it's a Roman colony is very important to us, as we'll see in just a moment. He tells us that they stayed there for several days. So we know that Philippi is the city to whom Paul later wrote the book of Philippians, and so all of that is important to us. And when you think about the book of Philippians, it's just all about rejoicing no matter your circumstances. And when we see what happens to Paul here, nothing went according to plan, but yet he ends up writing a letter to these folks. So Luke tells us that on the Sabbath day, they were expecting to go to some place of prayer. If they were expecting to go to a place of prayer, we can logically assume that they were going to pray. That was Paul's plan, was to pray. So it was a Sabbath day, and they went outside the city gate to the river to pray. Evidently, no synagogue in the city. One of the things that Luke tells us, that it was a Roman colony, and oftentimes in Roman colonies they would expel the Jews. They said, you got to get out of here, we don't want you here. And so Paul probably went to the city and said, where's the synagogue? As we've already learned, that was his habit. There was no synagogue, because in order for there to be one, there had to be at least 10 Jewish men. And if there were not 10 Jewish men, then they would not set up a synagogue. So probably fewer than 10 Jewish families there. But Paul said, well, let's just go to the river. I've heard there's a place of prayer there. So that's where we find ourselves, looking for a place to pray. He found these women sitting by the river. And only the mention of women indicates that there weren't 10 male Jews, and therefore they simply went down to the riverside because there was no place to worship. So they were just with these ladies, and Paul probably wanted to go to the river, saying maybe there's some Jewish people there, because oftentimes they would gather there to pray. But here's the thing I want you to see. This is where it begins to change for Paul, where it didn't go according to plan. Paul went to pray, but he ended up evangelizing. He went to pray, but God sent him to evangelize. He began his Macedonian work there as he got up that morning to go pray. Lydia was down at the riverside. Paul and the others arrived. They began to talk to them, and she already believed in God. The Bible told us that, and Paul gave her the chance to accept Jesus Christ as Savior when he explained to her that her God had sent Jesus to save her from her sins. She responded to Paul's message, and they baptized her. So she and the members of her household were baptized, and it was an incredible time. You can just imagine what happened. But that's not what Paul had planned to do. God interrupted his life. He had planned to go pray, which is what he was supposed to do early in that morning. How often do our early morning plans get interrupted? More often than we would like. So I want you to notice something as we're looking at that. That was Paul's plan, his plan to pray. Now, in the next set of verses, I want you to see his expectations as we talk about what Paul expected. And as we read this story, you will see that Paul expected gratitude, and we could expect that as well in this same situation. Let's read verses 16 through 24. Once, as we were on our way to prayer, a slave girl met us who had a spirit of prediction. She made a large profit for her own owners by fortune-telling. As she followed Paul and us, she cried out, "These men who are proclaiming to you the way of the salvation are slaves of the Most High God." She did this for many days. But Paul was greatly aggravated, and turning to the spirit, he said, "I command you in the name of Jesus Christ to come out of her." And it came out right away. When her owners saw that their hope of profit was gone, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace to the authorities. Bringing them before the chief magistrates, they said, "These men are seriously disturbing our city. They are Jews and are promoting customs that are not legal for us as Romans to adopt or practice." Then the mob joined in the attack against them, and the chief magistrates stripped off their clothes and ordered them to be beaten with rods. And after they had inflicted many blows on them, they threw them in jail, ordering the jailer to keep them securely guarded. Receiving such an order, he put them in the inner prison and secured their feet in the stocks. Now, Paul was simply following the command of Christ here. He was doing what he was told to do, where he was supposed to be, and I keep emphasizing that because oftentimes we find ourselves in the midst of trouble because of our own choices. We make some bad decision, some sinful decision, and we end up in trouble as a result of that. But I want you to see clearly that Paul and Silas were where they were supposed to be, doing what they were supposed to be doing, and they still ended up getting beaten and thrown into prison. Do you get that? Now, how angry would you be at that point? If you were doing exactly what God asked you to do, exactly where God asked you to do it, and you end up getting beaten and thrown in prison. All he did was cast a demon out of this girl. They were looking at this young girl as a prophet. Not with a P-H-E-T, but with a F-I-T. She was a prophet-making person for these men because she could predict the future, because she had a demon. And Paul recognized that, and she kept day after day aggravating Paul and saying this phrase, and finally he said he'd had enough, and so he turned around and he cast the demon out. Don't you think the people would be grateful for that? That they would be happy about this young girl no longer being tormented by this evil spirit? Surely we would expect everyone to be thankful for that. Paul expected gratitude, but what he received was imprisonment. That's kind of crazy. Doing exactly what he was supposed to be doing, exactly where he was supposed to be doing it, doing a favor for a young girl, and he ends up in jail. Just as a side note, one of the things you can see here, a couple of things you can see here. Number one, you can see the power of money and greed. These people were not concerned about that girl. They were concerned about their money. The second thing is, you pretty much see that all fortune tellers are about money. I mean, that's what the Bible teaches us clearly here. if you go to those people, and they're not as big anymore. At least I don't see the commercials. Remember the commercials that used to be on TV about call these psychics, the psychic hotline? Is that still around? Good, you don't know. You shouldn't know. I don't know either. But I used to laugh at it because you could see it had the psychic hotline, and the commercial, it had the tagline on the bottom, the disclaimer, for entertainment purposes only. Did you ever notice that? It's all about money. It's all about money. These guys were very upset that she could no longer make them any money. And what were the accusations against Paul and Silas? The Bible tells us very clearly, number one, these men are dangerous. And that's the way people view Christians a lot of times. They're dangerous. These men are troubling people, and they're disturbing the public peace. We're often viewed that way. Finally, the accusation against them was these men are teaching different customs, and they're carrying on illegal religious activities. Now, strict Roman law allowed conquered nations to continue their own religious practices, but it did not allow foreign citizens to come in and to proselytize those who were living in that city. So Paul and Silas were not allowed to come into Philippi and tell them about this new thing called Christianity. That was against Roman law. If you think about it, those same charges are often brought against Christians today by the world. How often do we hear it? Christianity is intolerant. Christianity is divisive. Christianity seeks to convert everyone. Even in this free democracy we know as the United States of America, we are quick to proclaim the idea of free speech. These same charges are made by the world against Christianity. Today, people are who speak out against Islam or against gays are considered bigots. But people who speak out against Christianity are applauded. I don't know if you've noticed that lately, but that's the way it goes. People may have expected everyone, Paul in particular, may have expected everyone to be happy about this, but instead he's ridiculed, he's imprisoned, and he is beaten. So we see a couple of things here so far about Paul and who he is and what he's done in following God. We see what he had planned, and then we see what he expected, and neither one of those two things happened. Then thirdly, we're going to see what Paul wanted. Look at verses 25 through 34. The Bible teaches us that Paul wanted to worship in these verses. About midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the prisoners were listening to them. Suddenly, there was such a violent earthquake that the foundations of the jail were shaken, and immediately all the doors were open, and everyone's chains came loose. When the jailer woke up and saw the doors of the prison open, he drew his sword and was going to kill himself, since he thought the prisoners had escaped. But Paul called out in a loud voice, "Don't harm yourself, because all of us are here." Then the jailer called for the lights. He rushed in and he fell down trembling before Paul and Silas. Then he escorted them out and said, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" So they said, "Believe in the Lord Jesus, and you will be saved, you and your whole household." Then they spoke the message of the Lord to him along with everyone in his house. He took them the same hour of the night and washed their wounds. Right away, he and all his family were baptized. He brought them into his house, set a meal before them, and rejoiced because he had believed God with his entire household. How cool is that? And you're where you're supposed to be. You're doing what you're supposed to do. You end up beaten and in prison, and then what do? If you're following God like Paul, you begin to sing praises. In a difficult situation, Paul didn't dwell on his circumstances. He was accused of crimes. He was beaten severely. And the Bible tells us he was imprisoned and put in stocks. And you and I immediately think of stocks as what we had here in early America. But I want to tell you what this more than likely was. They had a huge piece of wood, a trunk of a tree that was wide enough to where it stretched your legs until it was painful, and they chained your ankles to them. And so Paul, remember, had just been beaten, and he was either lying face down or on his back with this big piece of wood spreading his legs out, and he can't move, and he had not had his wounds tended to this point. And so he's laying there on that dungeon floor with this big, huge tree trunk, spreading out his ankles to the point where it's incredibly uncomfortable, so there's no way he could escape. And what does he decide to do? He decides to start singing hymns and praising God. He focused his thoughts on Jesus. What a lesson that is for you and I. He wanted to worship. He planned to pray. He expected gratitude. He wanted to worship. But here's the one thing they couldn't take from him. He was in the midst of everything he knew being torn apart. And yet, he decided to worship. When things are really falling apart, we need to learn from Paul that we have to focus on Jesus. And probably more so, we need to learn that when things are really, really going good, we need to focus on Jesus. There was only one thing that could really stop Paul from worshiping, and it happened. Paul wanted to worship, but again, he was called to evangelize. He had been beaten. He was laying on his back. He had his legs spread out. He was in pain, and he couldn't move, and so he just wanted to worship the Lord. But the Bible tells us that as he began to worship, as he and Silas began to worship, it clearly states that the prisoners were listening. And Paul and Silas simply found the will to honor God in bad times. And as a result of their honoring God in bad times, and hear me on this, in the midst of worship came deliverance. They weren't on their face before God saying, how terrible is my situation. I can't believe I have this disease, or I can't believe this is happening in my family, or I can't believe this or that. This is terrible. In the midst of that terrible circumstance, Paul and Silas began to worship God. And in the midst of worship came deliverance. Do you see the truth? God sent an earthquake, and the doors flew open. And I've had a professor tell me at a Christian school what a coincidence it was that an earthquake struck. I said, yeah. I said, to me, it takes more faith to believe that an earthquake struck at just the right time and in just the right manner to where all the prisoners' chains fell off and all the doors came open. It takes more faith to believe that's a coincidence than it does that God did it. And God sent that earthquake, and the doors flew open, and the jailer begins to panic because he knows his life is going to be taken from him, and he begins to draw a sword to kill himself, and Paul screams out, we're all here. These guys are still listening to what I have to say. The prisoners didn't go anywhere. They were prisoners. And when the doors flew open, it's logical that they would run. But they were so enthralled with Paul and Silas and what they were doing there, worshiping, they wanted to know more about it. So Paul had to quit praising and began to tell people about Jesus. And then, after talking to the jailer and letting him know that we're okay, we're here, don't kill yourself, Paul then took the message of Jesus to the jailer. And he ended up taking it to his entire family. Paul wanted to worship, but he ended up sharing the gospel with everybody in the prison, the jailer, and then the jailer's family. Paul planned to pray, but he ends up taking the gospel to all of Macedonia. Well, I also want you to see the last thing about Paul. We talked about what he planned. We talked about what he expected. We talked about what he wanted. And now I want to get to the feeling part of it. Because we live so much by our feelings. Paul felt like he would go back to prison. Let's look at verses 35 through 40. When daylight came, the chief magistrates sent the police to say, release those men. The jailer reported these words to Paul. The magistrates have sent orders for you to be released. So come out now and go in peace. But Paul said to them, they beat us in public without a trial, although we are Roman citizens, and threw us in jail. Now they're going to smuggle us out secretly? Certainly not. On the contrary, let them come themselves and escort us out. Then the police reported these words to the magistrates, and they were afraid when they heard that Paul and Silas were Roman citizens. So they came and apologized to them, and escorting them out, they urged them to leave the town. Can't imagine why. After leaving the jail, they came to Lydia's house, where they saw and encouraged the brothers and departed. Now, remember, Paul is technically still under arrest here. The jailer probably snuck them out during the night after all the doors had come open, and he snuck them back in before the morning, because the Bible tells us that he went and shared the gospel with the whole family. It infers in here that they were back in prison again. So technically, Paul was still under arrest. This jailer couldn't just let them escape, because he would be killed. And he knew that, and Paul and Silas knew that as well. So they were still under arrest in a Roman prison. The feeling the night before would have been further punishment. All these doors are open. We can't get them shut. I'm no longer in the stocks. There's going to be further punishment because of what God has done for us. That's what they were expecting. Paul expected punishment, but what he received was an apology. You see, sometimes the expectations that are not met or the feelings that we have are wrong, but they're wrong for our benefit. Things go better than we thought they would go. Paul really thought he was going to get in more trouble because of what God had done. He had already followed God right into prison, into a beating. So what would be different about this time? Well, what was different was that those who had put him in prison the day before came and escorted him out and apologized publicly to him. Sometimes things go better than you expect them to. Paul announced his citizenship, and it changed the attitude of those in political power. So we see Paul planned and he didn't get. Paul expected and he didn't get. Paul wanted and he didn't get. And Paul absolutely felt like something was going to happen, and it didn't happen that way. In life, things don't always go as planned. Expectations aren't always met. Desires aren't always fulfilled. Feelings don't always reflect reality. Things are going to go wrong. Or maybe they're going to go right. Consider this story of Paul and Silas. They were led by the Spirit to this place and ended up beaten and imprisoned. But listen to what Paul said about the Philippians and what he felt about these people later on. These are the very people that beat him and put him in prison. He said this in a letter to them years later. I give thanks to my God for every remembrance of you, always praying with joy for all of you in my every prayer. Because of your partnership in the gospel from the first day until now, I am sure of this, that he who started a good work in you will carry it on to completion until the day of Christ Jesus. It is right for me to think this way about all of you because I have you in my heart, and you are all partners with me in grace, both in my imprisonment and in the defense and establishment of the gospel. For God is my witness, how deeply I miss all of you with the affection of Christ Jesus. He said that about the people who beat him and put him in prison. What Paul had planned and what he had expected, not what happened. But what happened was God allowed him to evangelize this leading city in Macedonia to the point where he fell in love with these people. He had this deep-seated feelings for the people of Philippi. His time with them made some impressions upon him. And as Paul writes this letter to the Philippians, not the one we're talking about in Acts, but the letter of Philippians, when he writes it back to them, he's in jail again, and he's telling them that no matter what happens, if you know the book, no matter what happens, rejoice. Rejoice, and again I say to you, rejoice. He says, I may get out of jail, I may not, but either way, conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of Christ. That's what Philippians tells us. Sometimes what we think is going to happen doesn't happen, and things are going to go wrong. Our plan doesn't work out. It may be for the worse, it may be for the better. So what do you do when things don't turn out the way you expected? I want to tell you the story of someone making things right when they seem so wrong. You're going to see a picture of a guy named Oswald Smith. You probably don't know who he is, but let me kind of set this for you. Oswald Smith. The year is 1920. The scene was the examining board for selecting missionaries, and standing before the board was this young man named Oswald Smith. All his life, from the time he was able to know anything about God as a young child until young man, after he had done everything he needed to do, all he talked about was being a missionary. This one dream dominated his heart. Over and over again, he prayed publicly. He prayed, Lord, I want to go as a missionary in your service. Lord, open a door of service for me. And I'm quoting what he prayed regularly. And now at last, his prayer would be answered. He's standing before this board. Everybody that knew him, everybody that knew anything about him, knew that he was called to be a missionary, destined to be someone to carry the gospel to places that had never had it before. When the examination was over and the vote was tallied, the board turned him down. He didn't meet their qualifications. He failed the test. Oswald Smith had set his direction, but now life gave him a detour. What would he do? As Oswald Smith prayed, God planted another idea in his heart. It was clear. If I can't be a missionary, I'm going to pastor a church that becomes the greatest missionary sending church in the history of Christianity. And he did just that. He pastored what's known as the People's Church in Toronto, Canada, which sent out more missionaries than any other single church at that time. Oswald Smith brought God into the situation, and God transformed his detour into a main thoroughfare of service. And that's a modern day, or a more modern day story than that of Paul and Silas. And it can still happen today. All of us have had disappointments in our life. All of us have plans that have failed, expectations that were not met, feelings that just didn't happen, that were so wrong. What do you expect when things don't? What do you do when things don't turn out as you expected them to do? We've all had disappointments in life. And the sad thing is, most of us have allowed our hearts to be hardened just a little bit every time we get disappointed. A little bit more angry, a little bit more hard, a little bit less prayerful. In fact, I don't know very many of us that have learned the lesson of rejoicing in all circumstances like the Apostle Paul did. But today, specifically for you, I want to ask this question. Have you given up doing for God? Or more specifically, have you given up trying great things for God because you've been disappointed in the past? Because life didn't meet your expectations? And I want to say to you, welcome to the club, because there is not a person in this room that has had life meet all of their expectations, all of their plans, all of their wants, or all of their feelings. Has life beaten you up so much that you just gave up on doing these things? Or maybe it's not so much that life has beat you up. Maybe you failed too many times to think God cares about you anymore. No matter which situation you find yourself in, God still loves you. God still cares about you. He's kept His word to never leave you or forsake you. When things don't seem to go your way, we need to roll with the turns of life. When we're laying on our bloody backs in a prison with a tree trunk between our ankles, we say, I want to praise God. And that's when deliverance will come. Listen to what Jesus says to us in Matthew chapter 5, verse 12. No matter what your situation, this applies in all situations. Jesus said this, rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Are you living that out? Yours is probably not something as simple as a roll-up window in the church fellowship hall. It's probably a little bit more difficult than that. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether it's a poor engineering job on a roll-up window in the church fellowship hall, or whether it is you're sharing the gospel and you end up in prison and beaten. The idea is God has a plan. He has an objective, and He wants you to follow it. It may not be what you expected. It may not be what you planned. It may not be what you wanted. And it may not be what you felt. But do you trust God? Do you trust Him with every part of your life? Paul and Silas did. And look how it turned out for them. Let's pray together.